All right, we'll hit the first item on the agenda, which is the agenda for the board
Is
meeting.
James new to this group, or did I miss the last one?
Oh.
At the end. Hi, James.
Oh, hi there.
Welcome.
Hi.
Introduce yourself. Sorry.
Do you want me to introduce myself? Or?
Yeah,
Please,
yeah.
yes.
Well, I don't know. You spoke to me. It's all good.
Sorry.
So James Dinley, I'm with Governing Board Member Bartlett's office, so she'll be taking office and sworn in next week.
We're pleased to have you here.
Thanks so much.
Why don't we quickly have everybody else?
At least at the table, we're doing introductions. You want us to start, Mark?
Mark Bromwitz, and I'm board member Lou's board consultant, the governor's appointee.
Maria Iniguez, assistant to Dr. Parker.
I'm Ruth Ann Taylor-Berger, and I'm the board consultant for Councilman Benoit, who represents the cities of the county of Riverside.
I'm Philip Fine. I'm the deputy executive officer over the Planning and Rules Division, and was given the privilege of leading these monthly meetings.
And I'm Jill Weiner, I'm chief operating officer.
I'm Andy Silva with the County of San Bernardino for Supervisor Janice Rutherford.
Hi, I'm Ron Ketchum, board consultant to Larry McCallan, who's the representative for the cities of San Bernardino County.
I'm Matt Holder, the consultant for Lake Forest City Councilman Dwight Robinson, who represents the cities of Orange County.
Nancy Velasquez, Governing Board Liaison.
Most important person.
In the whole building.
And James, you'll see various staff coming in and out to present very briefly their items on the agenda. So, okay, so as we always do, we start towards the end. Just before the public hearings, there's a meteor item on the bottom of page 7, item 30. So that's okay, we'll start there. So this is the update on the facility-based mobile source measures. We've committed to come back and keep the committee, mobile source committee, as well as the full board apprised of progress on the 5 different mobile source measures, 2 of which are moving towards rulemaking. 1 is kind of in between, and then 2 that are working on MOUs with the ports and the airports. So we did brief a mobile source committee. And got some good feedback there, but we'll be bringing a very similar presentation to the full board. I don't know if you want any details necessarily, but happy to answer any questions. Or you want? I can go through each. I can go briefly through each of the 5. And
Would you
tell
please?
you where we are, or I could have. Maybe I'll let Sarah and you do it instead of talking all day. So.
Okay,
Sarah.
so we have the 5 measures: the airports, the ports, new and redevelopment, warehouses, and rail yards. And with the airports, we're working on developing a memorandum of understanding with them. They're first, before we get to do that, they're developing their air quality improvement plans. So they're developing plans with each of the airports to get emission reductions from the sources associated with them. I should say the sources that they're able to control, because the airplanes obviously are big sources of emissions, but they don't really get to have much control over those. So they're developing their air quality improvement plans. Once they have those plans in place, there'll be particular elements of those plans that will then incorporate into a memorandum of understanding for those individual airports. So we've been meeting with the airports to discuss this. They've been very cooperative, doing some technical work to try to better understand baseline emission inventories, and which will help us then quantify the emission reductions that we'll get out of the air quality improvement plans. And we're proceeding with a schedule that we would have something to agree to later on this fall. So with the marine ports, a little bit of a similar process in which we're looking to have a memorandum of understanding for emission reductions with them as well. It would be 1 MOU that would cover both of the ports, and that's because the ports already have their clean air action plan in place, and it's a joint plan between the 2 ports. And so similar to the airports, we're looking at an MOU that would then capture specific elements out of their clean air action plan, take those, quantify emission reductions that we think we're going to get for the implementation of the CAP, and then have that as part of our MOU. So we've been having some back and forth with the ports discussing that. I will say we probably haven't made as much progress as we would have liked, but we do have agreements and buy-in from ports executive management to proceed with the MOU development. So right now we have a technical working group that we've kicked off, to try to roll up the sleeves and get a better understanding both of the emission inventory and the types of methodologies we would use to quantify emission reductions. We've had 2 of those meetings so far, proceeding along that track, and in terms of timing, still hoping we'll have an MOU in place later this fall.
So what seems to be the sticking point? You said that you're not making the progress that you would like. Is there a specific issue that's kind of hanging
I
it
think
up?
there's been, a lot of back and forth in terms of whether, what an MOU would look like, and I think the ports are, in many ways concerned that they would be held responsible for targets that they wouldn't have necessarily in control of the meeting. We don't necessarily see it that way, and we're definitely willing to work with the ports to see what are reasonable assumptions of implementing this plan that you've already agreed to implement. What do we reasonably think we're gonna get out of that in terms of emission reductions? And so we're just figuring
it's
out.
process.
Yeah, process.
Thank you.
So on new and redevelopment, that's the one that's more of a hybrid in-between approach. We're kind of moving more towards regulatory options, and we were directed by the boards to continue to work with the working group and talk about regulatory options for that sector, but at the same time, really explore what different impacts would look like. So we've been talking with the working group. They wanted to have more of a study of what potential economic impacts of regulatory options would look like. And so we're proceeding with developing an RFP to have that work, and then, see what those results would be and continue those discussions. So it's on a bit of a slower track. We wanted to still have working group meetings and talk about the issues in that sector. Go ahead.
What is staff's thinking regarding emissions? Cause I noticed that most of the emissions from that activity are off-road or on-road vehicles. So we don't have a lot of authority over those 2 areas.
Well, we do have, for the vehicles that would be attracted to the facility, we do have indirect source authority to do some regulations, but then also with new and redevelopment, there's construction fleets associated with those developments. And so there's some ways in which we can look at, developing reduction or strategies for reductions.
San Joaquin has a rule under the same authority that they're implementing.
I've got a question. In the study, you're gonna be looking at the different costs and what's gonna happen from an economic perspective, and that's one of the concerns. Is there any way that you can really tell who actually is gonna pay the costs? Because I know that for a number of companies, when they have increased costs of something, there's always speculation of whether or not costs will be passed down, whether costs are going to be internalized, and so on. And it's always a guess, and it's always individual companies making their own decisions. So is there any sort of real methodology to be able to figure that out?
Well, so there's different assumptions you can make. Like one assumption is that everybody's a rational actor and things get passed down and it all works the way it should, which we know isn't always the case. You can do some scenario analysis around that where you run different scenarios of how you think people are going to react in the real world, and then look at that sensitivity analysis. So there's a bunch of different ways you can do that when you do economic modeling. But you're right, and I think it's one of the things you do where you take your best estimate of what things are going to look like as you would be implementing a particular program. I think monitor to see how it's working in the real world and make course corrections as you go along.
Okay, great, thanks.
So one idea we did have for new and redevelopment is this idea of a air quality mitigation fund, that could be something that we could put forward in terms of having folks voluntarily participate in providing additional funds and then being able to use those for emission reduction projects. It's an idea that we're kind of slowly rolling out. We haven't discussed it very much with the working group, but we're kind of continuing to flesh that idea out as well.
That would be a voluntary thing, right?
That would be a voluntary program.
So what's the option if they don't go for that?
Well, yeah, I think we're thinking of sort of the suites of approaches. That's one idea that we're thinking about for new redevelopment. There would probably be other pieces that we would have to that.
There's interest out there for this. It's not
Oh,
us imposing it on people. People come to us asking us how they can mitigate their emissions on some of these bigger projects. And sometimes the legislature tells us we're gonna mitigate the emissions based on those projects. So we're try to find a system that kind of formalizes that a little bit, and it could be a benefit to not only the developers, but to us as well.
But basically, I guess we're looking at probably creating even a little bit more expense for homeowners who wanna go in and buy a house with that approach.
Well,
'Cause
They would
it does
already
get
have your
back.
CEQA obligations.
Right.
One example that this could, let's say you have a big project and you're coming out as significant under CEQA, significant emission increase, and you wanna kind of buy down your emissions in a way to get you under significant, because then there's less requirements in terms of,
So you would tie that with CEQA.
it's all tied to CEQA. So then you might be able to get your emissions down to less than significant, just like people do for GHGs now with offsets. We would take the money, we would get emission reductions equal to or greater than what that commitment should have been. There's issues with local versus regional, so we don't want to you probably can't offset your local impacts with a regional program, but maybe there's a way we could direct the funds locally as well. So all those details need to be
I
worked
guess
out.
there's a real fine line in regard to concern about litigation, because you could be litigated by local entities, cities, or in the case of warehouses, there could be even some interstate commerce issues brought up.
For this voluntary program,
No, it's on the warehouse issue.
Well, that's not what we're talking, we're not talking
haven't even
about
got
that.
there
No, I know, but I'm just saying, in general,
Yeah.
there must be a fine line in regard to the concern about litigation.
So, but I wanted to ask something on the mitigation side of it. I've done these before. Yeah, everybody wants to pay their fair share. And the other side of it is return to source, that the potential if you have a basin-wide mitigation effort, that there should be some consideration of some percentage of return to source back to that county in which it was collected. We will get a much better reception from local governments, and that's where the source, that's what they're trying to mitigate. So that's something that developers tend to buy into much easier as well, is that a portion of their dollar is always going back to the county that it was collected in.
or city.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we gotta work out the details, but there could be a way that every time money's contributed, there's certain strings attached about how we can spend it. And then we would have to mix that up and make sure we meet all those obligations, but now we're leveraging funding from multiple sources to do bigger projects and better projects.
Let me know, I put one of the biggest fee districts in the country in place of a mitigation fee, so I'm happy to help you with the mistakes that we learn from.
So are you looking at a range of approaches, like ones that aren't CEQA related or ones that aren't voluntary?
Yeah, so on new redevelopment, again, that was sort of this hybrid direction from the board to start exploring regulatory options, continue to explore voluntary options, do some economic see what those impacts might be. Our working group recommended that we proceed with some economic analysis to try to flesh out some scenarios and model what those impacts would look like. So yeah, we are still thinking through what those options would be. I will say that this one is probably moving a little slower than some of the other facility-based measures, mostly because we've been asked to do kind of more thinking about those impacts.
Are you looking at any options that actually put a SIP commitment on local governments? They seem to be the only sector or entity that doesn't have a role or responsibility in the SIP. Their SIP was supposedly designed around fair share, and local government kind of has eked out of that for a long time.
So what do you mean by SIP commitments?
Well, you could have a local government be responsible through its planning either not increasing emissions or having a net reduction in emissions, that's SIP enforceable.
That is not a concept we've talked with the working group about.
And I think that that's a concept that would go over like a lead balloon with local agencies. Wearing another hat, I sit on the planning commission for Riverside County, and Riverside County has a number of items in their general plan that directly reference back to air quality and measures and reductions that they have to meet. So when I'm looking through those conditions of approval, I always sort of look at that stuff and start to push that envelope. But a lot of jurisdictions have that component in their general plan.
A lot don't though.
But, you know,
Yeah.
that could be something that's where you start, but the conversation is that
agree.
you put your greenhouse gas element in it, your air quality element, and at least in Riverside County, there are many jurisdictions that have that.
And that'd be a perfect way of doing it.
That's the
I'm
segue.
a former planning commissioner
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
And I had my city that jumped right up, and in order to meet the arena requirements, built a big affordable housing thing right along probably one of the most crowded freeways in the entire country. Created what I used to call a toxic ghetto for community members. So not all cities have that kind of
Sure.
sensitivity or commitment that Riverside.
So,
Yeah, we just need to be careful in how we how that approach
Yeah.
Yes,
goes forward.
I think there's kind of two areas this touches on that we have thought about. So one is in our quest for SIP creditable emission reductions, we're open to all ideas. So if a local jurisdiction has an enforceable general plan that has some kind of cap on emissions, like if we could use that and get SIP credit for it, that's great. That might be SIP creditable. So that's one idea. Maybe we need to explore that more, short of like forcing it on a city or a county, which is, as you say, going to be a problem. And whether we have the authority to do so
Right.
or not is another question. But Barbara just walked in and I'm telling you. But the other thing is, let's just say one of these facility-based measures turns into, especially for new redevelopment, some requirements on development. We've talked about what could be a model ordinance, right? So you're subject to our rule unless your local jurisdiction making those permitting planning decisions has their own program that meets these certain conditions. We have that for 2202 in rideshare, right? So you could be subject to our rules, or if we have a local ordinance that meets certain conditions, they could be subject to that instead, and then it keeps it more local. So that's also been part of the mix. I don't know how much in the working group it's been discussed, but early on, that was one of the options we talked about.
Okay, well, I hope you're looking at kind of the broader range as opposed to a more limited range.
So as he is sitting right next to me, I'm going to let Ian McMillan talk about warehouses and rail yards, as he's the main staff lead on those.
I just have one more question on that. As I think we all know, the affordability of housing in the state is a major issue for all people. Is the economic analysis going to compare housing costs to other states and what those cost breakdowns are for either for the building costs from California to other states such as Texas or Arizona and other things? Is the economic analysis going to cover that?
Well, housing costs is one of the issues that the working group asked us to look at in terms of the totality of the economic analysis. So that is one of the areas we'll be investigating.
With a comparison to other states and the breakdown of the cost for building new homes?
Well, I think we'll be looking at what, particular rule options that we can pursue, how those impact housing costs compared to today. So I think, I'm not sure what you mean by the comparison to other states, but the situation today versus what it would look like under different regulatory scenarios.
So in some anecdotal information I have is that it's 4 times as much to build in California than in a state like Texas.
Yeah.
And the materials aren't much different, but the cost of labor is different here. But also the regulatory environment in California is much different than in other states. So I was just trying to see if there was going to be a breakdown of what that cost differential is. Let's say it's 2 times or 3 times as much as other states. What's contributing to that difference between housing, housing development in California versus other states?
Yeah, we hadn't necessarily thought about that particular angle because we were looking at, what impacts of this, if we do a regulation here, what that would look like and how that would build upon existing costs. And that is something that we could consider.
This program also will fall heavily on Riverside and San Bernardino County versus the other two, because that's where most of the construction is.
And again, there's been no decisions, or we're looking at all these things. We don't know if there is a conventional rule, and if there is, it would include housing developments versus commercial or industrial development. So there's all kinds of different ways this can go.
Well, they all generate emissions from, indirectly. And so it should, you're gonna get the most pushback from non-residential, from folks from the elected side. But if you make the argument of how it, is gonna be equally distributed, because that's what we're talking about, fair share mitigation, you shouldn't eliminate commercial. Because you got the whole warehouse side. I mean, every grocery store, it's everywhere.
And there's always going to be thresholds for, we can't analyze every single project
Oh, yeah.
that comes through the basin. Like San Joaquin, they have thresholds too, but they're looking at 15, 20 projects a month. We'd be looking at 500 a month.
Well, and that might be something that if you have a regional program that you can delegate to the county, that the individual counties, and that here's the thresholds, and that analysis is part of the CEQA analysis of the project.
But does that not lead to maybe setting up MOUs with the counties where they will buy in?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Or model ordinances or things like that.
And if there's a return to source, you better believe that MOU would be much quicker in going through the system.
I just had one quick statement back to airports. Our airport, Orange County, John Wayne, is different than other airports. Every airport is very different. And so I just wanted to kind of just reiterate that as you go through MOUs or the possibility of MOUs with airports, that each one has different challenges and impacts, and each airport has done different things in the past to have cleaner air quality in and around the airport, and just to make sure that there's a recognition that each airport is different and that it shouldn't be a cookie cutter approach to each one. For instance, John Wayne is closed down from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, which is unique for most airports. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there to recognize that each one's different.
It's one of the reasons why we are having individual MOUs with each of the airports versus the port approach, where it's one MOU that covers both ports, and we certainly recognize those differences. And it's not just in operations; it's in just the type of airports they run. And so that's something we do recognize. So maybe I'll turn it over to Ian to give an overview on warehouses and rail yards.
So thanks. So on warehouses, what we've been exploring as staff and talking with the working group and briefing the Mobile Source Committee on is looking at the business model of the warehousing industry. That's really one of the things we've been hearing a lot from industry is warehouses don't control trucks. And sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not true. It really depends on the warehouse. Some warehouses do own their own fleets, some warehouses do contract with fleets, but many, if not most, do not. And there is a third party that is making these decisions. And maybe typically it's the cargo owner is the one that's making the decision on the trucking because they want to move their goods. And so if the warehouse operator doesn't own the goods, then they might not have visibility into what trucks are actually doing. And when we're thinking about emissions from warehouses, it really is the trucks, right? That's where most of the emissions are from. So we've been trying to take that into account of looking at what are these different business models. All warehouse operators, or many warehouse operators don't even own the building as well. So we've been thinking about infrastructure requirements or on-site requirements that again plays into it. If they don't have the ability to install infrastructure on-site because they don't own the property, then that's something that also has to be considered. So we've been trying to look at the different kinds of structures of what an indirect source rule might look like. We've been exploring, all the different options that are out there. No decisions have been made on what that structure looks like. We've been hearing some feedback from some environmental groups that they're interested in having warehouses do more to control emissions directly, that they need to take more direct control of the trucks. So one concept that's sort of a term that's out there, sometimes it's called facility cap. It's something that we've heard a little feedback from some community groups where warehouses will be required to control the truck emissions directly, and they would need to figure it out. There's different ways you can do a facility cap, whether it's you calculate some baseline and you reduce your emissions below some baseline approach, maybe some hard cap on emissions, some hard cap on trips. There's different ways to structure a cap kind of approach. So there's some things to explore there. A different system might be looking at, rather than having the warehouses control trucks directly, maybe there is some sort of requirement on warehouses that they ensure that emission reductions do occur, but you could do that tied into some sort of credit system. So say, for example, fleets that are cleaner than required by regulation generate credits. And then those credits would be available for, essentially for purchase from the warehouses. And they could get it directly from fleets or some sort of way of doing that. And the emission reductions would occur that way. You could tie that into incentive programs, such as Carl Moyer, et cetera. This would be maybe a little bit more flexible way for industry to comply. Certainly we know that there's going to be a lot of concern about economic impacts on the industry from this. Ford did direct us to conduct economic study as well, similar to the new development, redevelopment. One of the things that we are looking at, I think actually getting to the question earlier about what does it look like outside of our region? That's one of the things we are looking at with this economic study is are there warehouses that are going to, are part of warehouse industry that would potentially relocate if the costs are too high? And what does the market look like outside of our region? So that's one of the things that we're looking at as part of that study. So there's a number of different things that we're looking at right now. Really, we are kind of at an interesting spot of trying to figure out what is the structure of the rule. There's a whole separate question on what is the stringency of a rule. How much control is there through time? It's, likely some phase in, but what does that look like? But the general structure of the rule is another key issue that we're trying to deal with right now. So that's the warehouses. On rail yards, that one's moving a little bit slower. That's was always discussed as coming after the warehouse indirect source rulemaking. So we are still working with the rail yards. We've gone on some site visits to go take a look at their facilities. We've been talking with them about seeing is there something that can be done to really update those emission inventories. The last data we have is from about 2005. That's really solid, kind of nice granular details that is needed for this sort of effort. So we're working with them on that and still continue to explore the issue with rail yards.
Got a question on the warehouse. On the survey that was sent out, staff identified close to 400 warehouses. Some of them were up in the desert area, I can't count those. But I suspect that there are more than 400.
So I think the survey that you're referring to is a number of years ago, we funded a study to look at truck trips that go to warehouses and how many trucks go to a warehouse. And so that survey was really just trying to get some information from warehouses. It wasn't meant to be comprehensive. It was just to try to get a statistically significant
But there's
sample.
probably more.
And so there's a study, for example, that SCAG did looking at how many warehouses are out there. And it really depends on what is a warehouse. Something that's 10,000 square feet, there's many tens of thousands of those. If you're looking at maybe the 500,000 square feet bigger, you're looking at maybe just a couple hundred of
So
those.
that's my question. So are we going to set a minimum level?
Sure, that's something we're also exploring. There's a lot of interest on that question. I think, given the large universe of warehouses that are out there, starting at some smaller universe makes a lot of sense. But what exactly that threshold is,
Could the board members get a list of the high cube? I think that's the term, high cube.
Sure. High cube is there's a lot of different terms that are out there in warehouses right now. A fulfillment center, a high cube, a cold storage. There's a lot of different terms that are out there.
But those are the big ones.
High cube typically is what we think of as a distribution center. A lot of what's happening in the Inland Empire. We have some data products we just recently purchased, and we're analyzing some of that right now. We're bringing some of that analysis back to the board.
Yes. So as you can tell from the level of the discussion, this is probably gonna be the big ticket item at the board meeting. We had between, 25 and 30, I think, roughly people from Mobile Source Committee to testify. Don't think that we'll have, I don't know, that many or more, but
Probably more.
so that'll probably be the.
I do have another point about the entire discussion that happened at the Mobile Source Committee, that the public's expectations are not gonna be met by our activity, our decisions. And that's a serious concern I would have. Not that we can do anything about it, but that Dr. Parker finished up by saying that, exactly that. But they still have some real concerns. And I'm wondering if the district doesn't have a role in encouraging OSHA and what have you to take a look at some of the issues that were raised during these discussions. Prod OSHA to take a look at warehouses, because they were suggesting that or at least one or two of the people said that the temperature within warehouses get dangerous, and
We have referred things to OSHA when we specifically see a particular instance that we think is a problem. If we called OSHA and said, you ought to look at warehouses, that doesn't really point them. So what we can probably do is just follow up with that individual and encourage her to,
because we're gonna hear the same type of discussions at the board meeting.
perhaps,
But I think what Dr. Parker was getting at is we're never gonna have authority over those types of, those issues.
Right, we don't.
But I will say, in terms of expectations, we are meeting regularly with the Inland Empire environmental groups, and I think while you might not be detectable in some of their testimony, I think we've made a lot of progress in what the expectations are. I think this started out as them thinking this was gonna solve all problems in the universe. I think they're seeing some of the challenges we're running into. They're still gonna push us to be as aggressive as possible, but I think there's been some progress in expectations.
So just on airports, given it's the least amount of emissions, CARB this morning is looking at a zero emission airport shuttle rule this morning.
We're testifying. So yeah, the process with the airports will obviously take into account anything CARB is doing, implementation dates, future rules you're looking at. Anything else on 30? That'll probably take up most of the time, we believe, next week.
Enjoy your money back.
Okay, so item 31 is just a way for rule staff to say they amended 18 rules this year in one shot. I'm joking. It's a joke. So just real quick, last year there was legislation that we pushed that is kind of modernizing the notification procedures. All the state law required paper mail for a lot of these mailings that we're required to do. And this is kind of the first step in terms of amending a lot of our rules that have kind of those notification requirements set in stone. Just amending those to be consistent with the new state law to give us a little more flexibility in terms of electronic notification, and also some recent EPA changes that allow a little bit more on the electronic notification side and website notification. But it's not going to happen overnight. This is just the first step to allow that flexibility. But in order to take full advantage of this, we have a lot of work to do in outreach, collecting email addresses from a lot of facilities that we don't have on file now, coming up with our own kind of procedures on this. So this is just the first step to allow us some flexibility, but there's not going to be huge changes until we kind of get the full picture together. But we do on some rules that affect every, say like Reg 3, that's affecting pretty much every facility, we're sending out 27,000 pieces of mail. So, and we do that several times a year, so if there might be a way to streamline that a little bit to save a little money.
That breaks Mojave's record. There was a couple of months ago at Mojave, they had 4 rules on discussion. They passed them all with no presentation on one motion. And I'm like, any one of those at South Coast would have been weeks of gnashing of teeth. Mojave's a very different beast. Very nice.
Okay, any questions on that? We have the staff here if you have any questions. But, okay, there's nothing on that. 32, maybe?
So item number 32 is the annual Clean Fuels program report, and it's just an item that we bring to the board every March or so. And it just, this one represents a clean fuels plan update and report for 2018. And then staff has updated this plan with extensive feedback from the advisory committees, the technology committee, technical experts, and private companies. Funding levels continues to have like a balanced approach for projects for near-term benefits such as cleaner, more efficient engines, as well as longer-term technologies such as zero-emission battery electric and fuel cell trucks. Some of the notable projects that were initiated last year, I want to mention, were the battery electric truck project that we started with Daimler as well as with Volvo, and then we're going to be working with the Port of LA on developing fuel cell trucks with Kenwood and Toyota. So those are some of the larger projects that we started. Of course, infrastructure is a big part of that aspect, where we also look at load management strategies, battery storage, as well as putting in hydrogen stations or working with hydrogen station providers, as well as for electric charging equipment for heavy vehicles. So upon board approval, staff will report or submit the report to the full legislator. If I can answer any questions, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, the, last year, there was a proposal for allocation in the different areas. And that kind of seemed to get blown out of the water because of the Volvo project, which is a great project. Did everything else get funded basically the way you had anticipated last year?
So, Mark, you're correct. I mean, last year, the Daimler actually was the project that
Okay,
had the greatest funding from the Clean Fuels Fund. And it was a larger than normal, almost $9 million cost share on a $30-some-odd million project. We had already initiated some work that's been ongoing on the engine technologies, so that allocation didn't get funded to the same level. Battery electric projects obviously got a greater level, but fuel cell vehicles completed both on the heavy duty and medium duty fronts to also get that funding that is allocated. The allocation is strictly what we think is necessary for future year projects, but all the projects come back to the board on review, and those allocations can shift based on what was accomplished over that course of the year, based on a variety of different factors: technology readiness, potential leveraging grants from state and federal entities. So a lot of factors play a role into it. That final spending is relative to the initial anticipated allocation.
Great. Second comment is, and I appreciate the note you sent me about the advisory groups retreat that you had. But that's still not getting on the public calendar. So if you look at the district's master calendar, that doesn't show up yet. So folks still aren't knowing about that.
I'll certainly note that and make sure that that was
Lots of cool information in the phone book they've provided, including page 71, which has stuff spent on each technology. And so if you want to see where the money's getting spent, that's kind of a handy dandy table. And more detail than each sheet of stuff.
Read that entire report.
The entire thing, just like I read every 1,500-page agenda before Fridays.
Sorry about that.
Oh, there's tons of interesting stuff in here.
Anything else for Naveen? Okay, Lachlan?
So the next item is we are presenting the annual reclaim audit report to the governing board. This is our standard annual report on our cap and trade program called Reclaim. And we have been doing this for the last 25 years. Nothing unusual in this report. In aggregate, our 260 facility strong reclaimed universe has met its emissions obligations. Their actual emissions are lower than their allocations. Of course, on an individual basis, there are a few facilities that did not meet their allocations, and there are perhaps a dozen or so of those facilities, a little bit more than a dozen. Everything else looks fine. We stay below our thresholds, dollar per ton thresholds, which serve as red flags for us to conduct additional analysis and investigation. We wouldn't have to do that. One difference, just as we observed last year, this year was the same observation. The value of RTC credits that have been traded, as well as the volume of RTC credits that have been traded, has gone down significantly because the word is out that we are phasing out the market, the program. So people are reluctant investing too much in this venue. And I would say the value of the trades are 95% lower than what they were on average, over the last 10 years. Everything else looks fine, and we are in the process of phasing out reclaim. We are developing a number of bark rules that I think we are being briefed periodically from us, and I'll stop there.
We had our first facility we reclaimed under the new exit provisions.
Yes, we had the first facility, Boeing, basically, that successfully exited the market very happily from their perspective.
Questions for Lockie? Okay.
Just a full presentation with 15 PowerPoint slides.
15 PowerPoint, and we'll take the extra time, because the board, we have a lot of patience with us.
Especially
You
after
did a
the
great job at stationary source.
Okay, so we'll go back to page 2 of the agenda. First item is the minutes, which doesn't seem like we have. There's no questions on that. So we're setting hearing for 11:34, which is one of those barked landing rules for reclaimed facilities. Mike, you want to give them a 3 sentences? Three
Sure.
sentences.
The BART rule is for gas turbines, not the ones that are at electric generating facilities, but all the remainder. We're expecting to reduce just under 3 tons per day of NOx from that. We have one issue that we're still working out with one of the compressor gas turbines, but we expect to have that taken care of shortly.
That's 3 sentences, very good.
Any questions on that?
3 very good sentences.
Okay, on page 3, item 3 and 4.
So item 3 is school air filtration staff routinely brings this item about once a quarter to the board, mainly involving supplemental environmental programs resulting from either ARB or EPA violations and occasionally South Coast NOVs that are issued. This particular one is funding a little more than $161,000 for air filtration projects in the city of Azusa. The SEP is a result of US EPA discovered violations by Veolia on some hazardous waste regulations. On board approval, staff will work with IQ Air, which is our contractor, on implementing the air filtration program. And this particular technology, based on some of the violations that occurred, will focus on PM and odor control systems that will be implemented at those 2 schools. And then there's filter replacement for up to 5 years included in that. There's a nominal percentage for administrative fees that will be recovered out of that $161,000. So with that, I can answer any questions.
There was something in there which said 5 or 10 years that I had seen on the presentation. I was a little bit confused.
Yes, so we go in with 5 years of maintenance filters built in. If there's any cost savings in the installation, then we take any remaining funds and put it into additional years for the maintenance filters. So that's pretty much the process.
Okay, great.
On to item number 4, this is also an annual item. This particular one is for the Carl Moyer program announcement, estimated to be about $31 million of funding available. And it's hard to believe that this is the 21st year of this program as well, or year 21. This item also includes smaller levels of funding for the voucher incentive program as well as for the SOON program, or the surplus off-road opt-in program. This is an annual item where what we'll do is release the program announcements for these, provide education and outreach to all 4 counties, including Coachella Valley, on the availability of these funds. We've been working with fleets for, as I said, the last 20-some odd years. They're quite familiar with our program. We do a special focus outreach for smaller operators as well to bring them into this. Just the overall goal is to accelerate the fleet turnover for NOx emission reductions from both on-road and off-road vehicles and equipment. So with that, if I can provide any other additional details.
Well, one question, have we ever prioritized a region, an area within the district to get preferential treatment?
So the program is available historically for all of the Southwest Air Basin and Coachella Valley. Where we've used our All-Air program from a focus perspective, if you want to call it, is AB 134. Those funds were not limited again to any of the specific cleaner communities identified under ARB's program. However, subsequent funds may be focused in those areas. So in that type of a special circumstance,
Well,
we may focus in.
the reason I ask is that I think we have 3, our source receptor areas. We have 3 source receptor areas that still exceed the 12 micrograms per cubic meter annual average. And I'm wondering if anyone's given thought to focusing on those areas. I think that one's South Central LA, and then one's in Riverside, which is pretty high. I think it's up close to 14.
Yeah, it's something that we can certainly explore. The Carl Moyer program has very specific guidelines that the state adopts. So we'll have to work within that constraint, but certainly if there's an opportunity to focus some of the funds, we
Any other questions? So is it next year that this amount will roughly double because of the legislation?
I think next year we're estimating a $4 million.
Yeah, we're referring to AB 1274, the extension of the smog abatement fee. So that's actually being phased in beginning this year. So this year we got about 4 million. Next year we think it'll be about 8 million. It's going to be phased in as more vehicles qualify.
Oh, okay. All right,
So-
number 5.
I'll take this because Sujata is actually at an offsite SB meeting. Excuse me. So basically, this is a fairly routine item. Every year, we have to bring something through the public process on our statement of investment policy. There are a couple of very minor wording changes. They relate to the rating of what we're able to invest in. Those are shown in underlined strikeout in this very short document. And then the other is, there's no changes, it's just renewing the delegation of authority for our treasurer to invest or reinvest, and that's LA County.
Questions on that? Ron, you want to take the next 2?
Yeah, good morning. This is a standard request to transfer and appropriate funds in order to complete a number of application development projects, including a permanent streamlining and a mobile app for the Android. Funds are available in the budget, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And the next one is, again, this is a standard request it's a standard annual request actually, to obtain approval to purchase 1-year maintenance and support services for server and storage. The funds are available in our budget, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
No questions? Derek, number 8.
And useful to too. The next item is to execute a contract for our environmental justice outreach and initiatives. We issued an RFP. There was only one responder. That responder is the current contractor for us, the entity. This is for a 1-year contract for $160,000 with 2 one-year options to extend. Happy to answer any questions.
I do have a question, not on this item, but wasn't the school, that school program, the consultant, wasn't that coming back to the March board meeting?
Yes, I believe that's going for the actual vote of the board, yes, in March. Or no, it's going to committee, I'm sorry. It's going to committee. It's going to committee in March, and then it's going to go to the board in April.
Oh, April, okay.
Okay, any questions for Derek?
You know, one quick question, just curious, I might know the backstory on this one. One respondent, is this a specialized service that no one's interested in, or what's going on there?
No, we've had previous, when we issued RFP last time, we probably got 3 or 4 respondents. There was interviews of all 3. We sent it out to the same group of folks, and, you know, we advertised it in the newspapers, in each one of the counties, and we just got 1, so.
Okay, so we're on to page 5. Any questions on the MSRC item? Should I have?
We got a grant funded by MSRC through SCAG, so we're very excited. Just have to do the paperwork. It's actually a really cool program.
Is that, what are they, 2766 match?
I'm not sure. It's like $2.7 million to reduce VMT. And our project is that, because we're such a big county, deputies will be able to apply for warrants from remote locations. They'll be able to contact a judge and not appear in person in front of a judge. So if you're out in Needles or Barstow or something.
Okay. So there's no questions on 9. So there's 10 and 11. 10 is just a report back from the health effects. This used to be the Brain and Lung Tumor Foundation. The name was changed to Health Effects Air Pollution Foundation. It was a foundation board meeting, so that's just a report back. Any questions on that? And then 11.
We're amending the charter that if folks on a couple of our advisory groups miss more than 2 consecutive meetings and they do not notify us, they notify us fine. If they don't notify us, then they're going to be taken out. No longer be part of the advisory.
We also had a request from Dr. Liu that this was such a good idea, we should look at all of the other committee groups, so that's in progress, and we'll see if that's an appropriate thing to recommend as we go through these again.
Okay, any questions on that? So 12 through 20 are receiving file reports. Any questions on 12 or 13? And then,
The rural forecast,
yes,
any?
want to change 6, but that's okay, yeah.
Pardon me?
Rural forecast, yeah, item 17.
Yeah. Didn't you say 13 to 18 and you're moving on?
I was going to pay it, but it's fine.
Okay,
Any
I'm
questions
sorry.
on any of the reports?
Yeah, you jumped the gun.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I got so excited.
I'm an order, Mr. Abramowitz.
Any changes? I believe there are some. Can't remember.
That's it.
Yes, you'll have to wait. Thank you, I appreciate that.
The changes, it's very easy to find because we call out the changes
I know.
right on the front page. It's not circled here, so I don't know if it's out there
I think
yet.
it's in the package.
It's probably in the package.
It is in the package.
I don't think I saw it, but I'll look again.
Okay.
Anything big you wanna,
I honestly cannot remember. I can tell what's big or not big anymore.
It's what
I
the
think
definition.
the delay of 1410 is in there. We had it for June or July, obviously with what's going on with the board, that's what happened, so. That's probably, yeah, it was May, so yeah, that's been delayed.
okay.
All right, and
You know, if I didn't ask, Andrew was gonna ask.
I was trying to be good.
I'll just mention, most of these are monthly reports, but item 20 is actually an annual report, still in this section, so if anyone goes to the 2766 program. Any questions on that? On page 6. And then page 7,
22 through 29.
One question.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead, Ron.
no, you go first.
I had a question regarding the sales tax issue that
Yeah, that's all
we're
right.
pursuing and looking at. And,
No longer sales tax issue?
well,
It's the
whatever.
owner district authorization.
And how we're working with the other counties, specifically Riverside County, sort of issued a letter.
Yeah, so I know that, for instance, the RCTC.
Right.
Person came by at the last ledge committee meeting and talked about their concerns about it. They want us to work with them. We got language, we're submitted, and then once the bill gets introduced, you know, because it may be amended by the author or by the ledge council. So once we get that, then we'll send it out, then we'll start reaching out again
Okay.
to the other stakeholders.
Okay. All right.
You have an author, deadline's tomorrow.
Well, we have, the deadline is tomorrow, but it's, you can submit a
Spot bill?
spot bill. So I think we have an author, but I don't want to say it because I don't want to jinx it, I don't know. But I'm confident.
Because we look at new bills every day, but tomorrow there'll be 2,000 of them, so.
But,
When you have an author, will you let us know who that is?
Definitely gonna let the ledge committee know.
well, the board should be able to see the results of the survey, though.
Yes, and so that was presented at ledge committee.
I know that.
So, I'm not sure, where.
Well, that was just a subset of the board, so I mean, I think the entire board should see the results of the survey.
So I believe
It's part of the package.
it was in the package.
Okay.
And it got sent out, when it gets sent out to ledge committee, it gets out to all the board members. So the board members should, and you should have received it, part of that.
Okay.
So does the survey results in the package, I haven't seen that yet, does it include all of the cross tabulations that were part of it, so the whole thing is great?
And San Bernardino County Transportation Authority voted unanimously to oppose, so there's that.
That was based on the old
RCTC, right.
legislation.
Yeah.
That was based on
Pardon?
the old legislation, so
Oh,
it's different legislation now, so.
What's the new name? I'm sorry.
So it's a voter district authorization, what we got and Barbara can.
So I just wanted to say that the actual title of the bill is a little bit different because the voter district authorization concept is good for understanding what it means, but it wasn't the right technical legal language. So just so you don't be surprised, you'll say it's a ballot measure election bill, so.
And so essentially what the feedback we received in Sacramento when we first were talking about a sales tax bill was jumping ahead. We need to first create a district so that all four counties can vote on a district basis, not on a by county basis. So that's the first thing that we have to do, and that's the first step in this process, is doing that. Now, whether the board or some other community organization or member wants to put a ballot measure on it, that's something that's.
Does that have to be authorized by the legislature? The citizen ballot initiative?
Yeah, well.
They don't need to be authorized for that.
Well, there's.
Can they do that on their own without legislation?
We could not because there are two reasons. One is that the power of initiative only extends to whatever an agency has the ability to do. So we do not have the ability currently to enact a sales tax. So that public initiative couldn't do that. And then secondly.
Oh, they could, the public could not give you that authority.
Right, without the legislation allowing that.
Gotcha.
So that's, and then the other side issue is that there are also already some statutes governing the initiative process for districts as opposed to cities and counties where it's a constitutional principle. And we don't fit within the definition of the district that can use initiative. So I had to put provisions for us for those two purposes.
I'm jumping way ahead. Let's assume this goes forward. what happens to those cities that already are maxed out in regard to their sales tax?
So we're proposed in the draft legislation would be that this, this particular tax, if enacted, would not count against anybody's cap. So it would just be as this, it didn't exist for purposes of the cap.
Okay.
And it's a legislative cap, so the legislature can do that if they choose.
Any other questions on that? So, I think that's the agenda.
I do have one additional question. I'm not quite sure where it would be on the agenda, but maybe other business or public comment is on 1403 is, Governing Board Member Robinson had a meeting with some agencies in Orange County Water District agencies this last month. And so I was wondering if there's been outreach from SCAQMD staff to the water agencies in response to the letter that was sent to the district following last month's meeting. And if, regardless of whether there has been communication yet or not, is there a plan to reach out and have communication with those agencies, especially the water agencies in Orange County?
Sarah?
Yeah, so we have not responded to that yet, and part of that reason is that we actually got a whole bunch of inputs and letters and comments in that week before we were gonna go to the board on that rule. We're still evaluating all of that input and trying to figure out which direction we're going to go as a result. And so, when we've done that, we'll be likely having another working group meeting, but probably will also respond affirmatively to the folks who contacted us.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, anything else under other business? Any of the
Your
members? want to-
former boss gave a very nice presentation yesterday in Sacramento and got a very nice award this morning. I have 2 screens on my desk so I could watch his presentation while I was doing other work.
Pretty cool.
I haven't had a chance yet.
It was a typical 50-year history, but he's very good at putting it in ordinary language.
Let me go into a very esoteric area. This is gonna be one of the coldest months we've had since January 1979. And there's a thing called the North Pacific Oscillation, which is a broad 20-year, upward to 20-year cycle. And I think we've gone into the cold, or warm, I don't know which cycle it is. I think it's the cold cycle, beginning in 2014. And interestingly, our ozone levels, or the number of days in which we exceeded the ozone standard, went up around 2015 up to 2018. And it may be more responsible for this cold spell. And I'm just saying that with our climate consultant, I don't know if that's been awarded yet, they should take a look at that. You see what impact that may have on our ozone.
Just one correction is 2016, 2017 were high, 2018 numbers look lower than the
But
previous 2
above the,
years.
you know, if you look at the 20-year average, it was above the 20-year average in regard to the number of days exceeding the federal standard. I have time to look at this stuff.
It's been nice to be retired.
And I don't even want, barring any type of criticism, I am reluctant to even mention the fact that we're at record low sunspot activity, which also relates to increased clouds and increased rain. So you might want to throw that out to them and see if they just laugh or say, well, we're going to take a serious look at that.
We're not doing a climate change study. We're doing an effective potential climate change on some of our air
My
quality.
point is, if you have increased cloud cover, it may actually reduce the ozone. That's why I'm throwing that out. You may want to take a look at that in regard to whether that would result in less ozone because of the increased cloud cover.
That's one of the things we are looking at.
Does this cold weather help our 2.5 attainment, or does it go the other way?
I will say that.
Well, the wet weather's helps.
Rain helps.
The rain helps.
Rain definitely helps. So very preliminarily, 2018 looks pretty good for PM 2.5, much better than the previous 3 years.
But the question is, what does it impact ozone because of increased vegetation and maybe increased natural hydrocarbons coming up?
Well, we're still worried about, it depends on the VOC NOx ratio, so it's not a direct effect. But yeah, for PM 2.5 at least, looks like 2018 is pretty clean. And so far this year, because of the rains, it does seem pretty, we only get those 24-hour exceedances between November and February anyway, so this winter has been pretty clean.
We haven't brought on the consultant yet, have we?
No, we had to, I think we extended it to try to get more out of it. Just before it closed, we wanted to make sure we did a little more outreach, I think we extended it. Okay, any other business? No public comment? No members of the public? Okay, we'll adjourn the meeting until next month. Thank you, everyone.